I actually suppose we can understand why the disciples would be wondering just a little bit about who's the greatest. It's really part of our upbringing. I mean, we will always want to be conditioned and taught by society to be smart, to get ahead, to do the right things, to get a good job, to give good advice after advice of ways to be better, that we might be able to get ahead in the world. If you go to the bookstore, look at the self-help section. It's huge. Look at the religion section. Usually it gets smaller and smaller. But we can get ahead. We can get ahead. You can do it. Don't worry about it. If you can't figure out what to do, don't worry. Your Facebook feed or your Instagram account or anything else online will be happy to give you advice freely, except for the really good articles that you really want to read, and then you have to actually sign up for something or pay for something. But there's something about that it's going to be packed ways to improve your life, ways to get ahead, to be all that you can be. Those disciples, they'd just bought into it a long time ago. But we always hear that the disciples of Jesus just don't get necessarily what he's teaching. But perhaps they are practical enough to wonder, with Jesus continuing to talk about all this suffering that he may take up and that he'll be put to death, that somebody surely is going to have to lead the group. Somebody's going to have to take over. Who could it be? Who are we going to fall to or follow if something happens to Jesus? They're still thinking in earthly terms. Can't really blame them. I probably would have done the same thing. But it sort of makes some logical sense. Someone will have to take over, organizational continuation kind of plans. It reminds me a little bit of the stereotypical car ride that's often featured in the movies or on the shows of young siblings sitting in the back seat on a car. It doesn't matter how long the car trip is, and they fuss and fight the whole time. Mom, he touched me. I didn't touch you, I didn't touch you, I didn't touch you. And you move, and you're like, oh, I didn't touch you, you touched me. Those kind of stories. As an only child, I really didn't have to endure that very much. I was always the kid when we got there after I'd had my nap in the car, I was like, ooh, let's go swimming. Let's go exploring. And everybody else was ready for a nap. I had that side of it. But the way siblings fuss. But Jesus, once inside the house, he kind of takes the disciples aside, which is pretty interesting. He didn't just stop on the road and just address the issue right away. He was, they got to where they were going. They went inside the house. It's a separation. It's a time for instruction for the disciples. And that happens a lot. Jesus takes the disciples aside. Maybe that's an indication and a help for us to remember to set a little bit time aside, to be able to reflect in personal prayers in our own lives, not just always depend on the go, but the setting aside of just a little bit extra time. What is it Martin Luther said? He had so much to do that day. He spent an extra hour in prayer that morning. Sometimes we have to set ourselves, the agenda aside just a little bit. And Jesus asked them, what were y'all arguing about? Already really knowing the answer, and they're silent because they know he won't be happy with them. And yet, even without their confession, Jesus knows exactly what they were talking about. Whoever wants to be first must be last of all, a servant of all. There goes against the turning the head of society upside down once again. What do you mean? To be first, you've got to be last. And to be great, you've got to be a servant. That's not the way our world teaches us. It wasn't back then, and it's not now. But it is the way Jesus upsets and changes and turns our lives around. And then to prove the point that Jesus takes a child from the middle of the room, somewhere in the house, takes the child and embraces it in his arms and says, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me also welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. So to welcome the very presence of God into their midst. by merely welcoming a child. Today's world, in the first century Greco-Roman world, things look a little different about children for the most part. They were the least valued kind of members of society back then. A father actually had the right to sell off or to pawn the kid. You know, we would not take kindly to that, although there are stories of that from human history across the ages. That's not a culture practice that we adhere or think's a good idea. In the Jewish community, things were a bit better for the kid. They at least were respected and thought of a bit. But really, only it mattered once they had gotten to the age of accountability in a few years. But Jesus embraces the child as of great value, pulls it into his arms. And even with that imagery is an imagery of protection and care and love. Jesus, a few verses later, just when you think the disciples might have got what he was teaching this time, a few verses later in chapter 10, there's children coming up to try to see Jesus, and what do the disciples do? They push him away. I mean, not even really 2 full chapters, they've missed the point again, which is too is good news for us. But he also there again welcomes the children into its midst. Jesus is trying to teach the disciples how to be his followers. He continues to hope, or at least hopes to continue to teach them, that despite their thick-headedness, good news for us, that they too are welcomed, that they too transform their lives, that they too were brought into the fold. Jesus goes on to say to welcome the children is to welcome him, and to welcome him is to welcome the very God presence into the midst. A powerful reminder to us to welcome other children, and in doing so, we welcome Christ and God into our lives and into our world. But that's not just young people. John Wesley, in his notes, said that sometimes the children that are welcome into the midst are those of us who haven't practiced faith that long, who are young in the faith, that we too are welcomed into the mix. People who are new in the faith or lack the maturity of the gospel in their lives, as most of us do from time to time. You know, I love that about John Wesley's theology of this idea of perfecting grace in our lives, sanctification. That, you know, it's just not once a decision's made, you're done with it. You never have to think about God ever again. Once saved, always saved is not a United Methodist belief, despite how we often want to lean onto it. But it's this conscious decision that goes on over and over in our lives, whereby we want to be more and more like God in our lives. Some days are going to look better than others. Experience and reason teach us. But as we continue to grow closer to God, that our lives are transformed to be more like God's life. That's that idea of sanctification, perfection in holy living. You know, it's always one of the questions in ordination. Do you expect to go on to be perfect in love in this life? There's some conditions. Yeah, you're not going to be perfect, but to be made perfect in love in this life. Yep, we're striving after it. Not because of our own efforts or our own will, but because of God's grace living in and through us to reach out to others in the same grace and love that God has reached out for us. For faith lived out is a process whereby the quest of our own desire or wishes are transformed to better reflect God's desires in our lives. The things that make God happy make us happy. For we see with the same lens of Christ, our hopes, our loves. Not just the disciples were told to welcome a child, like our faith continues to build in our midst. We continue to be transformed and changed, and our hopes and our dreams continue to reflect God's goodness in this life. Oftentimes, in the hurried patterns of the world and our lives, it's hard to hear the call to a stronger, more fulfilled, life-changing faith after the desires of Christ. The things that make Christ happy make us happy. in all that we do. Christ invites us to be the least of all and the servant of all. And that interesting in the Greek text, actually, from the text for child and servant are based off the same roots. So to be this idea of the servant and child is playing in the background in the text. Also to be reminded that those that are typically thought less than are lifted up in the kingdom. That's part of what God does through the power of Christ in our lives and in our world. Jesus invites us to be least of all and servant of all. That reflects God's goodness into the world, with our loyalties first and foremost always to Jesus, yielding ourselves and our wants to the calling that is before us to model our lives after Christ and to grow more like Him every day. Never, ever, ever giving up. There's an idea, though, on that sometimes that is the idea of getting, grasping, and receiving. I thought about that when we come around the table for communion. You know, I was in South Carolina when I was at Statesville. Our handbells played at Spoleto, which was wonderful. It was a neat thing to have a church handbell choir play at Spoleto. And that Sunday morning, we went to a Methodist church there in Charleston. And the preacher came around when it was time for communion, and it was kneeling communion, you know, served by tables. Took a while. It was a pretty decent-sized congregation. And so he sat there, and the preacher brought the bread around, which I just thought that was interesting, which was good. And people were asked and invited just to touch the bread. You know, I know as people think about communion, that's kind of stuff, you know, like, oh, I don't know about that, you know. I'm like, just go second. Everybody else got the germs. But, you know, Bob, if you go first, you're in trouble. But this preacher went down the aisle, you know, went around the kneeler rail and just kind of held the bread. And I was over here at the end on the opposite side. And I thought, well, my theology is not that we reach out and take the bread, we just get all we want. No, my theology is that it's a gift given to us, that God shares that with us, that it's given to us. And I thought, Lord, I'm in somebody else's church, and what am I going to do? So anyway, I thought of no better place in the Union to start a protest than Charleston, although I don't recommend that. But I thought there is precedent for protest in Charleston. I think this one was better than the other one. But anyway, so he kept coming around. Everybody kind of reached out and got their piece of bread. And it got over to me, and I just held my hands. And he shoved the bread at me. I'll never forget this. He shoved the bread. Now, some of you know I'm a little bullheaded. And so I sat there like this. And he shoved the bread at me again. And I thought, this could go on a while. Finally, in kind of this air of giving up, he grabbed a piece of bread and put it in my hand. And the choir director was right beside him. He did the same thing. It was great, you know. We changed the way that we received communion that day. It's received. It's God's gift given to us. Our lives are transformed through God's presence in our life. It's freely given. It's not reached up, and it's not controlled, and we can't demand it when we want it. But we hear God's Spirit speaking to us over and over again. The invitation to follow, to take up God's way, and to allow it to be in our lives. This grasping versus receiving, the one thing that we always remember is that it relies upon God's grace. It's dependent upon God's grace to be able to take root in our lives. That we set aside the things that we want, the desires of our hearts, and we invite God to transform our lives into a new way of living. For it is truly only He that can transform us into the people that we truly are to be. All glory, honor, and power be to the one who was, who is, and who is to come. Amen.